We cannot think of the emerging world order without India playing an important role.
India has found itself at the crossroads of foreign policy following its decision to abstain from voting against Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
There is growing convergence between India and the US in terms of how they see some of the challenges in the world. The difference, of course, relates to Russia.
The move has sparked debate about India's global strategy at a crucial time as it prepares to take over the leadership of the G20.
The G20 has become huge in India.
India has long followed a policy of non-alignment, but this stance has been reinvigorated under the Bhartiya Janata Party.
India is still, non-aligned, right? It doesn't use the word non-alignment anymore, but it is still non-aligned.
As the world becomes increasingly multipolar, the question is whether India can continue to remain neutral.
Does India want to be on that global stage? And the short answer to that is increasingly yes.
Complicating matters are India's relationships with China and Pakistan, as well as its position in the Indo-Pacific region. How can India strengthen its strategic orientation in these areas?
You need to work with the dominant power of the day.
And how can its participation in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue aid in this effort?
And the broad message that India tries to bring is that they see the Quad not as working against somebody, but for something, and working together.
All of these questions carry important implications for the United States and its strategy in the Indo-Pacific. This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, India's foreign policy conundrum and what it means for the rest of the world. Joining us today is Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh, former Indian ambassador to the United States, Professor Waheguru Pal Sidhu, clinical professor and director of the United Nations Specialization at the Center for Global Affairs School of Professional Studies at New York University, and Dr. Manjari Chatterjee Miller, senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, and associate professor of international relations and the director of the Rising Powers Initiative at the Pardee Center at Boston University. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggett, president of Network 2020.
So I would like to start with you, Ambassador Singh, with a scene setter question. If you could just kindly give us a primer, and I realize that this is hard to do, on how India's foreign policy has evolved from its post-colonial non-alignment strategy to where it is today, and what are some of the current foreign policy decisions that you're seeing that might indicate how India's foreign policy is evolving?
No, thank you. Of course, on this subject, I could speak for hours, months, or do a whole semester course. But to capture it in a few minutes, just to say that broadly, one can say that India's foreign policy has evolved in three phases. Immediately after India became independent in 1947, we entered into the phase of the Cold War and a bipolar world structure. And India had to work out its foreign policy in that framework. Since 1990, we came into a phase of unipolarity in international relations. And India had to rework its strategy, relationships, keeping that in mind. And now we are entering when, once again, people are talking about contestations in international relations, a multipolar world structure, a change in relative balance of power, with contestation between US, Russia, and China. And India has to work its relationships, keeping these factors in mind. Now, in all these phases, I think the other dimension that impacted on the India relationship is how the major powers saw their global relationships and global priorities. And in the framework of those priorities, where did they see the relationship with India? And the importance they attached to India in terms of economic, trade, technology, security, and other dimensions. And then given that, what were the relationships of each of these powers with Pakistan on the one hand and China on the other? Because that impacted on the India relationship. So that's how it played out. So if you look first at the broadly bipolar phase for India from about 1947 to 1990, The US tried to create a network of military alliances around the world in their bid to contain the Soviet Union. And they wanted India also to look at becoming part of this alliance structure. And India had just emerged from a phase of colonialism and wanted to maintain independence of its position in international relations and not have it sort of subjugated to decision-making elsewhere in the international system. So India opted to stay out from military alliances, opted to promote the framework of non-alignment in the international context, and also build economic partnerships through the developing countries in the framework of the South, the Group of 77, and other relationships. Now, because of that, some challenges emerged in the US-India relationship, because you remember there was a comment by some senior US leaders that if you're not with us, you are against us, and are not accepting the fact of staying non-aligned or not necessarily siding with one or the other on every issue. As a result of that, India's relationships with the Soviet Union consolidated without any formal alliance arrangement. And the Soviet Union became an important supplier of military equipment to India, economic assistance to India. And the US entered into a military alliance structure with Pakistan, which impacted negatively on the US-India relationship. But at the same time, US saw India as an important voice in the international context, a democratic India, developing India, as an important voice in the international context, which was different from the voice of the message that was emerging from a communist China. And so the US remained supportive of India in that framework. And in 1962, when India had a military conflict with China along its sort of undefined borders, it was the United States that was most supportive of India politically and in terms of military supplies than any other country, more than even the Soviet Union, with which India had a very good relationship. So that was one phase of the relationship. Now, when the unipolar structure emerged, with the Soviet Union dissolving itself, India had to relook at doing its relationship with the United States. And it was not easy because US was not quite paying the same level of attention to India. And the US wanted India to join up in various multilateral arrangements, particularly non-proliferation arrangements, the Non-Proliferation Treaty and others, which India was resisting. And in 1998, India conducted a series of nuclear tests, showing clearly that it had nuclear weapons capacity, which was not acceptable at that time to the US. And the US came in heavily criticizing India, bringing about sanctions against India. But after some time, US took the position that even though India had remained outside NPT, which US had not wanted, India had conducted itself as a responsible country by not proliferating nuclear technology, either inwards or outwards. And then US assessed India as a responsible country in terms of having advanced nuclear technology. And with keeping that in mind, they started a new phase of relationship with India, which started in 2000, when President Bill Clinton visited India. And he was, before that, President Carter had gone to India in 1978. It was after a 22-year gap that President Clinton went to India in 2000. After President Clinton, a Democratic president, Republican President George Bush advanced the relationship very significantly by doing a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India, signaling that even though the US did not formally accept India as a nuclear weapons power, it accepting India as a responsible country with advanced nuclear technology, it would make an exception for India from international rules and US laws and change US laws to allow civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India. Now, this was a very significant move because now it allowed cooperation between India and the US in high technology. And eventually this agreement was done in 2008. Before that, India hardly bought any defense supplies from the US. Between 2008 and now, India has contracted to buy more than $20 billion worth of defense supplies from the US. The national security advisors of the two countries are going to be meeting in Washington on January 31 this year to start a new process of cooperation in critical and emerging technologies. AI, quantum, 6G, 5G, semiconductors, space. So this is something new that is happening, process that was started then. After President George Bush, Democratic President Obama took the relationship again several notches further by being the first US president ever to have visited India twice in his tenure, by being the first US president to have visited India on Republic Day. Today is India's Republic Day, the day we gave to ourselves our constitution. And it is strange that a US president had never visited India on the day India established itself as a democracy. Again, reflecting the challenge in the relationship. And President Obama declared support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. And he declared India a major defense partner. Then after that, President Trump, and Republican and controversial in many ways in the US, but he continued advancing the India relationship. And by declaring India as STA 1 level authorization, Strategic Trade Authorization Level 1, for technology releases to India on levels similar to that being done for NATO partners. And again, that consolidated relationship. And even under President Biden, the relationship has continued to grow. So I think step by step, what has happened since then is that the India-US relationship is very strong. They have declared a comprehensive global strategic partnership. Defense cooperation is growing. But while this is happening, India, which sees itself also as an important global power with an independent voice and wants to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision-making, has worked to maintain its relationships with Russia, which has been an important partner with India, and has also tried to be a voice for countries in the developing world. And only recently, India convened a meeting of about 120 countries from what is described as the Global South to come together, express their views on different issues that are important in the international context, climate change, development issues, which India would then reflect to the meeting of the G20. And this year, India is going to be the president of the G20. It is coordinating various meetings leading up to the G20 summit in September. And if you can see the manner in which India is conducting the meetings, organizing them, trying to bring discussion on the issues, the aim is to project India as an important interlocutor on the international voice with its own message and decision-making to bring on the international context and also carrying the voice of countries of the developing world. So I think that's where we are broadly. And of course, we can elaborate and fine-tune the various dimensions of this broad picture.
Well, thank you very much for giving us that initial arc. Professor Sidhu, I'd like to turn to you now and just talk a little bit about, if you wouldn't mind, how the domestic political situation informs or doesn't where India is going with its foreign policy. Is there a connection? And if so, what does that look like?
Thank you very much, and many thanks to Network 2020 for the invite, but also for Citrusly for organizing this important discussion on India's Republic Day. It's very auspicious in that sense. I just want to sort of flag, I think, three important timelines or timeframes, which are important for this discussion to understand how domestic politics is an important component in India's foreign policy as well. The first actually, and here I'm going to use the work of Angus Maddison, who did a lot of work on global economies. The first is to recognize that in 1500, India had 25% of the global share of the GDP, 25%. It was the single largest economy in the world. Over the colonial era, that amount, that share kept dropping, and by the time of India's independence in 1947, it was 4%. So at the time of India's independence, there was an implicit understanding that one of the drivers for India was going to be to want to go back to that, towering position of share of the global economy. But it was actually made very explicit in June of 2005 by the then Defense Minister, Pranab Mukherjee, who was speaking at Carnegie. And he basically talked about four deficits. The historical deficit, where the need for India to connect with Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the role of the diaspora. Second, the security deficit, which Ambassador Singh has already talked about in the neighborhood, but also the Cold War. But the third was the economic deficit. And there he actually makes an explicit reference to wanting to go back to the year 1500, in the sense not time travel, but in the sense of having that share of the global economy. And last but not the least, the recognition that India also faced a global decision-making deficit, that it was not on the high table where lots of these decisions were being made. So that's the first key element that we need to keep in mind. Second is at the time of India's independence. Like many other newly independent countries which are coming out of colonization and the process of decolonization, there were debates of what was going to be India's future. And like many other countries, and here again, I'm going to use some of the work of Pankaj Mishra, the three schools emerged in India. One was what you might call the traditionalist or the reactionary schools, who really wanted to go back to this kind of notion of the glorious past, the golden age, and largely with one particular religion or dynamics in that. And today, that trend is kind of very much reflected by the BJP, the ruling party, Prime Minister Modi, but they're not the only ones. There are others as well. A second school of thought that emerged was one of the modernists or the moderates, and here they basically wanted an a la carte approach of modernization. So diving in and getting some of the Western norms and values, but not all of them, carte blanche. And this in many ways was represented by the Congress party and Prime Minister Nehru, who also became India's first prime minister as well. And the third sort of school of thought was really that of the revolutionaries, who wanted to overthrow the entire sort of system and start anew, and here you would probably put the Marxist into that category. Now, the important thing to recognize is that everybody agrees on the broad consensus that India needs to go back to where it was in the 1500s. But how to go back is the big debate. And this is where these three schools of thought come into the discussion and the contention as well. And mind you, it's important also to recognize that all of them coexist at the same time. So, we haven't reached that conclusion as to one is better than the other. The constitution, which India is celebrating today, is actually a compromise of all three of these in a process, but really kind of an homage, if you like, to the moderates or the modernists in that sort of context as well. The last thing I'll sort of say is, once the economic reforms began in 1991, irrespective of whether you were a traditionalist, a modernist, or a revolutionary, everybody got on board of how to, that this was the direction that India wanted to take. So, for example, if you look at some of the articulation of the previous dispensation under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he very much recognizes that development remains the number one objective, but number two, that there's a need for India to create a conducive world order for India's development priorities. And so he actually draws out what he called the new punch shield, the 5 principles, where again, democracy is a very important component of that as well. And not surprising, that is one trend that has continued. And Prime Minister Modi, who among is seen very much in that first group of traditionalists, also talked in 2019, just before the pandemic, where he talked about the 3 Ds, which are also going to determine India's kind of foreign policy approach. Number 1, democracy. Number 2, the demographic divide. And third, India's huge market, or the demand that India is going to have for global resources, etc. And this is really what is an important imperative for India's foreign policy. And just one last thing I'll sort of say, that non-alignment in various shapes and forms kind of seems to underline this process going forward, but in different ways, and most importantly, strategic autonomy. Because even during the Cold War, it was non-alignment that allowed India to get steel plants from the Soviet Union and nuclear reactors from the United States. No other foreign policy would have allowed a country like India to do that. And that's something that is likely to remain, whatever the outcome is going to be of the foreign policy or of the global order going forward. Let me stop there in the interest of time, and very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Miller.
Wonderful, thank you. I feel like we've gotten a crash course on a lot of things already in a short amount of time. Dr. Miller, I'd like to take it to present day right now and really look at foreign policy. So when you're looking at India and its foreign policy, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see, and how would you assess India's ability to navigate them right now?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Courtney. I'm delighted to be here, and it's really an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. So I think that both the ambassador and Professor Sidhu have touched on some of these important points, but let me draw them out a little bit. So I would say that today, if you would ask me today to name India's three biggest challenges, I think it would be managing its three geopolitical challenges with China, with Russia, and with the United States. And that has there are effects of that spill over into other areas, which, like geostrategy, geoeconomics, et cetera. And let me touch on each of those, and then I'll explain what I mean by the spillover. So Ambassador Singh touched on the China-India border war. And essentially, if you look at the China-India border war of 1962, it was really a sea change in India's mindset towards China, and actually towards even what its military challenges were in the world. And that border issue never really went away. Right. So what happened was that in the 2000s, it was, I think, 2005, that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh at that time visited China, and he went and met President Hu Jintao, and they decided that the relationship could move forward if they set aside the border dispute temporarily. And you see India-China trade taking off at that time. China is one of India's biggest trading partners, but that border issue was never resolved. And then the skirmishes in the 2000s started picking up, with the most serious of which were in 2020 in the Galwan Valley, where you saw the first lives lost since the 1970s. But you had a skirmish in the Dawang sector as recently as December of last year. And so what you have a situation now is, I think I think Galwan was really a wake-up call for India, because there was a realization that this border issue, you couldn't set aside the border issue, it wasn't going away. And that, in the words of one very senior official, China would change the status quo and then call it the new normal, and then negotiate from that standpoint. So the sense of distrust that India had always, had towards China, where China was its biggest challenger. Professor Sidhu referred to India going nuclear. Well, when India went nuclear in 1998, it didn't cite Pakistan, it cited China as the reason that it went nuclear. And so, that sense of distrust was always present, but was exacerbated in the 2000s. And then there was this realization that this border issue was not only not going away, but that China was changing the status quo and calling it the new status quo. And so, whereas India wanted to return to the status quo pre-2020, that was not happening. And so that challenge then also crystallizes this big fear which exists in the Indian government's mind, which is, I think, really a nightmare scenario, is what happens if there's a two-front war, right? Because you have China's relationship with Pakistan. And so what happens if the border clash escalates and you have a two-front war with China on one side and with India, Pakistan on the other? And so if you take that relationship and you put it in the backdrop, and I'm saying the backdrop of the India-US relationship, because India's relationship with China is not why the India-US partnership developed. It's one of the reasons, but it's not the main reason. But if you look at the India-US relationship, what you see is a development in the partnership that has really taken off in the last 10, 15 years. Now, what's interesting is, I think, that partnership, if you look at the India-US relationship today, it is not the relationship that existed 15 years ago. It is definitely not the relationship that existed 20 years ago. I mean, in 1990, after 1998, the US put sanctions on India, but it's not even the relationship of 5 years ago, right? So the partnership has expanded in every single sector, and there's a lot of common ground in many different areas, and that includes China, right? And so since 2020 and since Galwan, I think since that realization that this China border problem is a huge issue, that the playbook that India believes China has in the South China Sea might be replicated on the border as well as in the Indian Ocean, that relationship with the United States becomes crucially more important, particularly as here in the United States, we've seen that there is now bipartisan agreement on the threat faced by China, which was also not the case, 5 or 10 years ago. So what you see is this convergence on what the big geostrategic threat is. Now, that doesn't mean that India doesn't have to manage the relationship with the United States, right? So you have China as a huge challenge, but then you also have the challenge of managing the partnership with the United States, because even while the partnership is expanding, India is still, non-aligned, right? It doesn't use the word non-alignment anymore, but it is still non-aligned. It has to manage this relationship with the United States. It definitely does not want its relationship with China to be equated with the China-United States competition, because that would be deeply problematic. And so what you see is this convergence of interest that, yes, we have a common geostrategic threat, but no, we are not as explicit about it as the United States has been about China, right? So and you can see this play out, like, for example, in a grouping like the Quad, where India has been very reluctant to frame the Quad as an anti-China grouping, even though that is absolutely the implicit subtext of the Quad, right? Now, the third challenge that India is managing today is Russia. And this plays into both its relationship with China and the United States. So with Russia, India has a very strong historical relationship this began post 1947. So in the beginning, Indian leaders, a lot of whom were socialists, were deeply admiring of the Soviet Union, and that admiration was not returned. Stalin really looked down upon many of the Indian leaders, but it changed once Khrushchev came into power. And you had a deepening of the relationship at that time, where the Soviet Union became the Cold War power, even though India was non-aligned, that it depended on for military supplies, right? So it became its biggest military supplier. And there was a reason for this. Soviet arms were much cheaper than the United States, and the Soviet Union very rarely had conditions imposed on the selling of arms. Along with that, you had many P2P, people-to-people exchanges as well, that really cemented the relationship. So you had cultural exchanges, you had India-Soviet, friendship societies, and so for many decades, the Soviet Union was the power that during the Cold War that India thought of as a friendly power. Now, after the Cold War, as Ambassador Singh just said, the Soviet Union, disintegrates. You have Russia, but all of these years of depending on Russia for military arms and supplies means that it's not that easy to diversify away. So even though after the Cold War, India begins diversifying away from Russian arms, what you find is that, even today, and again, the statistics vary on this, but anywhere from 60 to 80% of Indian military hardware is Russian. So, a part breaks down, you have to go to Russia. You want a software upgrade, you have to go to Russia. So there's a legacy there that is not easy to escape. So even though India is now buying arms at higher rates from countries like France or Israel and even the United States than Russia, the fact is that it's not easy to diversify away because there are interoperability issues, there are intelligence issues. So that reliance continues. And there's also a level of trust. I mean, there is a diplomatic level of trust that if, there is a war with China, Russia, even though it's getting closer to China, will not take sides, right? So what this means is that this historical legacy means that India has to really think very carefully about antagonizing Russia, because the last thing it wants is a Russia-China alliance, right? That would also not be good news for India at all. And so with the relationship with the United States coming in, what you have is this three prongs that India is trying very, very hard to juggle. On one hand, it's deteriorating relationship with China. On the other hand, it's historical legacy relationship with Russia, which it does not want to deteriorate badly. And then you have this deepening partnership with the United States. And it's a very hard act to juggle all three. Okay? And in the middle of this, if you throw in the Ukraine war, which complicates matters further, whether it's with regard to fertilizer prices or oil prices, what you see is India taking advantage of opportunities. Russian oil is very cheap now. India does not have energy reserves. So buying Russian oil becomes, an easy call to make. But how does that then play into its relationship with the United States, right? Obviously not well. So those are the 3 points that at which in different areas, not just strategically, but also geoeconomically, you now see India juggle. So the last point that I'm going to make is one of the really key ways you can see this is through the G20. right? So the G20, India is not only president of the G20 this year, but it is also chairing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Russia and China both belong to the SCO, and they both belong to the G20. The G20 has become huge in India. So there are meetings in 56 cities, which is unprecedented. The Modi government has really associated itself and the BJP closely with the G20. The symbol of the G20 is the lotus. That is also the symbol of the BJP. It was chosen for a reason. It's an election year. You have an election year coming up. So how Mr. Modi, executes this leadership in the G20 is being seen as a test of India's clout in the world. But you have to manage your relationships in the G20. So while India wants to be a bridge, use the G20 to be a bridge between the West and the global South, the question is, how do you manage actors like China and Russia in the G20? The United States is not going to be happy if dealing with Russia in the G20 is business as usual. So you can see these three geopolitical challenges that India is facing play out in a number of ways, both strategically, but also geoeconomically. And so I think this year particularly is going to be crucial, because how it juggles this, what calls it makes, how it treats these relationships, I think will set the tone for the next 5 to 10 years.
Right. Thank you. This has been a terrific overview. I have lots of other questions on my own. What I'm going to try to do now, because we're about at our halfway point, I will try to work in a few more questions for you, as well as start to work in some of the questions from the Q&A. So what I want to do right now, Ambassador Singh, is turn to you and pick up on some of the threads that Dr. Miller put out there. We started discussing the Quad, we started discussing India, the really tricky balancing act that India needs to do between China, Pakistan, China, Russia, and the US. And so I'd love for you to just elaborate a little bit. You spoke, you gave a good overview of US-India relations in the past, but, looking at the relationship right now, what are some of the, the top challenge that you're looking at and sort of the top area of opportunity? How would you respond to what Dr. Miller put out there before?
So in terms of the US relationship, I think clearly there's a realization in India that there is growing convergence between India and the US in terms of how they see some of the challenges in the world. The difference, of course, relates to Russia. That's one. So let's put that aside for the moment. But in terms of the economic, technological, and military challenge from China, there's some convergence between how India and the US assess it. There's difference, but a lot of convergence. So I think the Quad has provided a forum for them to come together, work on different issues. And the broad message that India tries to bring is that they see the Quad not as working against somebody, but for something, and working together to see if they can, other countries in the region, ASEAN and others, see the arrangement as also being of benefit to them in terms of the cooperation, the economic opportunity. An attempt was made to do a vaccine during the COVID that they bring to other countries in the region. So that's how they are looking at this partnership. But as this progresses, I think one of the things that India and the US will need to do is deepen their technology partnership, because that has been so far a weak area. Because even though in defense we now have a lot of cooperation, India and the US, India, for example, does more military exercises with the US than with any country in the world. And US does more military exercises with India than with any country outside NATO. So those developments have taken place, but in technology partnerships, there's a bit of a lag. And again, since there is a realization that the critical and emerging technologies that I referred to earlier are going to completely transform the way we live and work, it would be useful for the two countries to build a partnership in those areas so that you have new frameworks for engagement and cooperation with each other. So that's the effort that is going to be made. But as they do it, I think in terms of India and the US, they have to make sure that the differences that may be there in terms of the approach to Russia, they are handled in a way that it doesn't disrupt the relationship. But again, the US has that challenge with its other partners. If you look at Israel, it doesn't follow entirely the US line on Russia. There are differences. Israel has maintained a certain approach to Russia because it needs Russia to allow Israel to continue to operate in Syria. to deal with its own interests. And similarly, Turkey has not quite acted the way the US would want in terms of the approach to Russia. And yet Turkey has been able to maintain its independence of stance and be able to work out certain things that are useful for everyone, including the agreement on movement on food and fertilizers. So that's one dimension of the relationship. And I think the other challenge India has is clearly its convergence with the US is growing in terms of the economic and technology opportunity among the big powers. It is the United States that provides that opportunity for India, not China, not Russia. But while doing that, maintain to the extent you can the relationship with Russia. Because as Dr. Miller mentioned, there's a history of a military cooperation partnership. Even today, 60% of our defense inventory is of Russian origin. And therefore, you cannot have the effectiveness of that presence being jeopardized because of any kind of a difficulty in the relationship with Russia. And you want to prevent Russia going over to China on India-China issues, or whatever may be the other close partnership they build on economic, energy, and other security cooperation. And the third element India has to handle is clearly the challenge from China. And I think the sense in India is that China wants to prevent India's emergence in the international context and is doing what it can to keep India challenged directly through its own actions along the line of control, as it has done in East China Sea or South China Sea, and also by encouraging Pakistan to the extent that they can to try and keep India occupied in South Asia. But there, I think the problem for China is that Pakistan has run into its own problems. Its economy is in a very difficult situation. They have just a couple of weeks of imports that they can do with their foreign exchange reserves. There are reports of shipping companies refusing to call at Pakistani ports for fear that they may not be paid. So the economy is in deep trouble, and they are politically very, very divided. So in Indian consciousness today, till about a few years ago, Pakistan was seen as one of the challenges. Today, there's hardly any consciousness of a challenge from Pakistan. It is the challenge from China that people are looking at in terms of the economic and military challenge. So I think that's what India is working its way through, that how do you push back on China, but if possible, continue economic relationship. China continues to be the second largest trading partner for India after the United States, although it's a heavily imbalanced relationship. Maintain the relationship with Russia and deepen the partnership with the United States. And so this is what India is working its way through.
Thank you. Ambassador Singh mentioned Pakistan, and we're getting a couple of questions in the chat that are focused on the India-Pakistan relationship. And so, Dr. Miller, I'd love to turn to you, just if you wouldn't mind just going a little bit more in depth into the current state of India-Pakistan relations and how India's geopolitical security concerns with Pakistan have heightened, or how that's related to the threat with China.
Well, I'm going to punt a little on that to Ambassador Singh, but in general, India-Pakistan relations are not good. There is no trust. I believe the Pakistan recently offered talks, and they were, not taken as a serious offer. And really, Pakistan is not a challenge, as Ambassador Singh just said. That is not the challenge. The challenge is China and China's relationship with Pakistan more than anything else. And I think that has really focused on a couple of aspects. One is, of course, the border. So I think I mentioned a two-front war, the possibility of a two-front war, which would, of course, be the absolute worst-case scenario. But there is the issue of Pakistan supporting cross-border terrorism. And there is the issue of China's investments in Pakistan, so the Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC, which is a source of concern. And so these, I think, all continue to be massive challenges, but that is not the relationship that India is looking at so much as its number one geopolitical challenge. It's a consequence that is exacerbated by other geopolitical challenges.
Great, thank you for that. Professor Sidhu, we've talked a lot about, or we've mentioned a little bit about India's role on the global stage, taking the reins of the G20, unprecedented meetings in 56 cities around the world. You yourself are, very focused on the United Nations. I'd love to get your sense of how India's role is evolving on the global stage, where they see that they have leverage points, how this fits into an overall strategy.
Thank you very much for that. And I think here I'm going to use a little bit of my historian sort of background to look at the context of, how we've seen rising powers or great powers start to play a bigger kind of global role, right? The best example we have is actually from the late early 20th century. And essentially, if you look at the Great Britain, was the dominant power. And there were two, maybe three rising powers: the United States, Germany, and maybe you could include Japan in that as well. It's very important to recognize that that Great Britain chose to work with the US to make sure that it became the successor power and not with Germany. And I think that's a very important lesson for us to keep in mind, that rising powers don't necessarily only rise on their own. It's almost impossible. It was impossible then, and it's even more impossible now. You need to work with the dominant power of the day. And I think that's been the important shift that you have now seen, particularly on the part of the United States. Because again, if you look at the late 20th century, the early 21st century, you might argue that there were two contenders for that position: China and India. And for a very long time, the US bet on China, on the assumption that it could be socialized, brought into the more liberal model world, et cetera, and also the fact that historically China was already on the Security Council because India wasn't even independent there, and this is one of the sleight of hands of history that dealt India a bad card as well. But I think that, as Ambassador Singh and Dr. Miller have pointed out, changed with this growing recognition on the part of the United States that it now wants to work more with India, not necessarily as an alternative to the United States dominant power, but as a partner to that, because there's far more proximity and areas of convergence, even though there are areas of divergence. And I think that's an important element, which is going to give India more scope to play on the global stage as well. And here I think there are two aspects to it. Number one, does India want to be on that global stage? And the short answer to that is increasingly yes. And the simple reason for that is not that India wants to be a global hegemon, far from it. It needs it, as I mentioned, for its own domestic purposes. According to some estimates, India even today has more poor than 26 of the poorest African countries. At the same time, it has the third largest number of billionaires in the world. So there's a huge challenge in context. And the only way that India can determine its development future and challenges is by playing a greater role. So whether it's climate, it's cyber, it's maritime, it's energy, you cannot have a global arrangement without the Indian perspective. And here you have a little bit of a disconnect, because India is really not there in many of the decision-making bodies, particularly the United Nations and the UN Security Council in particular. And here, interestingly, at least 4 of the 5 permanent members have, with different degrees, supported India's permanent membership. The one country which has not is China. And I think thereby hangs the tail again to tell you how that is going to be. But whether it's through formal processes or informal processes, we cannot think of the emerging world order without India playing an important role in that some way, shape, or form. And I think increasingly India recognizes that and is ready. And as Dr. Miller pointed out, a very good example of this is the G20. Which is, they're trying very hard to move it from being just a club of, the biggest economies, the richest economies in some ways, to actually also serving the role of the other developing world as well. So watch this space. India is going to be far more active in other aspects of global aspects. It already is the biggest UN peacekeeper, since the history of UN peacekeeping anyway. So I think that's going to continue as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to pick up on that thread, Dr. Miller, and turn to you. We have a question. So we just spoke about India's role on the global stage in a more formal way. We have a question. I'm going to see if I can say it properly. So, contrary to much of the opinion voiced in the West, which is sort of maligning the non-alignment position, does that non-alignment position enable it to play a constructive role between divergent positions? So how does India use its status to navigate other tricky relationships in a less formal way?
Yeah, happy to talk more about that. So first of all, I will say that non-alignment is a dirty word in India today. So, it's the BJP government does not use the word non-alignment. It's associated with the Congress party and the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. India calls it strategically autonomous. So strategic autonomy, which in effect means exactly the same thing, in my opinion, particularly if you dissect it theoretically. But that's the word they use, strategic autonomy. Now, in terms of non-alignment, do I think non-alignment has served India well? Yes. In a word, yes. I think non-alignment has served India very well. I think it served it very well during the Cold War, and I think it served it very well in the post-Cold War. And I think part of it is because non-alignment allows a country, because the way the philosophy of non-alignment was articulated by Nehru, by Tito, it was not about it was about essentially serving your own interests, irrespective and outside of military alliances. That was the point of non-alignment. It was not neutrality. It was never neutrality. And so I think what has happened in the past is that people have associated non-alignment with neutrality, but that was never the goal of it. The goal of non-alignment was essentially to say that as a country, our strategic interests come first, and we will use whatever country necessary to put those strategic interests first, irrespective of whether they're a communist country or a democratic country, whether it is the Soviet Union or the United States, right? That was the point of non-alignment. That was actually quite brilliant. It really was. And it enabled India to get copious amounts of aid from the Soviet Union. It enabled India to get amounts of aid from the United States. And I think what was really interesting is, if you think about it, the United States and India never had a good relationship, right? Never, right? This partnership that came about, the friendship that we talk about today, is so recent. And yet, during the Cold War, India was in a position where it was friends with a country that the United States saw as a huge threat. And yet India's relationship with the United States never, ever, ever deteriorated to the point where a conflict was even remotely possible. That is a very difficult stance to maintain. And it was true because of non-alignment. Okay, so non-alignment itself was brilliant. Now, I will defend this academically, theoretically, and policy-wise. Now, today, if you fast forward today, we don't talk about non-alignment, strategic autonomy. Let's take that. It essentially comes down to the same thing. And I think it is serving India well, because if you look at India today, India is in a very fortunate position. The United States, India feels, needs it in a way that it didn't 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And so what you have is a situation where India is buying copious amounts of oil from Russia. Russian oil imports have displaced Iraq as its top supplier. And there's not even a hint of any kind of thinking about secondary sanctions in India. You have not had the Biden administration be at all publicly critical of India. I don't know what's been said behind closed doors, but publicly, there's been nothing but forbearance and making of India feel as if its interests are being listened to and heard. This could not have come without a very long history of non-alignment. The United States knows this is how India rolls. It has always rolled this way. Right? I think there's a deep value to that, and I think it has served India well.
I'd like to pick up on that with you, Ambassador Singh. You've been in the hot seat in Washington. You've had to navigate those difficult relationships. What does that? I'd love to just hear you respond to what Dr. Mueller had to say, and get your sense on how that works going forward. As someone who's a seasoned diplomat.
The way the US system works from the perspective of US policymakers, of course, it's easy if every other country accepts what US decides. Now, unfortunately, again, in the US system, decisions emerge from an interagency process. And once that decision is made, US expects its allies and partners to fall in line unconditionally. And I heard that even from my European counterparts, that they used to be very worried that they were not consulted before US took a decision. And once the US decided, they want to line up behind that. Now that becomes difficult for a country like India, which has a different history compared to the United States, which has a different geographic location in the international context. So the interests cannot 100% converge on all issues. And therefore, it's important for India, in its own interests, to be able to take decisions on any issue, assessing its own interests. So, for example, the question that was posed to you was that by maintaining its stance of non-alignment or strategic autonomy, is India able to contribute to resolving issues in a conflict situation? So, I would be very wary of India getting into that necessarily, because India does not necessarily have the clout to bring the two parties together. And you may end up alienating one or the other or both. And this is what happened in the 1950s. India played a very important role when the Korean conflict was going on. And India's voice mattered at that time. But at the end of it, the United States, Korea, China were all very unhappy with what India was trying to do to resolve the issue. But I think what strategic autonomy does is enable India to make its own choices. Now, for example, in 2003, when the US went into Iraq, and many of US allies and partners had to go along with the US, India distanced itself from the US decision. And in retrospect, everybody assesses that it was wrong on the part of the United States to have gone into Iraq. And similarly, India has not aligned itself with what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And the Indian Prime Minister told President Putin that this is not an era of war, despite the very close relationship between India and Russia. And so today, for example, when European countries are cutting down on Russian oil and picking up Asian oil, which India had been buying, and India has stopped purchases from Venezuela and Iran because the US wants countries to cut down on those purchases. India has no option but to look for other options for getting oil. And then because of its relationship with Russia, it is able to pick up the Russian oil. So I think what the policy of strategic autonomy does is gives you space on any issue to take decisions, make policy choices that work for your interest.
Thank you. Professor Sidhu, turning back to the domestic scene, we have a question from someone who asks, how has India's growing authoritarianism, how is that shaping its foreign policy? Would you mind commenting on that?
Certainly will, and with your permission, I might take up a few of the other questions which are related in some ways as well. Well, I think in some ways, if you refer to what I mentioned about Prime Minister Modi's 3 Ds, the democracy, demography, and you mentioned as well how India is now becoming the largest population in the world vis-a-vis China's withdrawal and demand. I think clearly, authoritarianism is a trend that you don't see only in India, but you're seeing it in other places related to populism as well. But I think it certainly goes against the pronouncements for democracy and the role that democracy plays. And so I think it's fair for Indians and non-Indians, I think, to hold, the Indian dispensation to what its own utterances are on the role of democracy and not to sort of support the authoritarian dimension of that as well. I think 3 things, if I might very, very briefly. One of them, and these relate to the questions as well, and we've been talking a lot about non-alignment, but I think one important element to recognize is India is also very much following on from the UN Charter, and that is about the rule of law. Right? And essentially, the Charter does not distinguish between democracies and authoritarian powers, right? Otherwise, the Soviet Union and Russia would never have been a member, etc. And again, India has actually been quite consistent in these kind of violations. So, for example, India has constantly abstained every time it was on the Security Council when one of the permanent members violated the council. So let's take the example of Iraq in 2003. India again abstained, as it did, by the way, in Ukraine, on the Ukraine issue as well. So there has been a degree of consistency. And to that extent, India pays more weightage to the role of rule of law and the charter than it, say, does to the notion of democracy, right? Because that's the one great equalizer. And this, I want to relate to two questions that have come up. One on the Indo-Pacific, and there you can see that both India and the United States are very, very clear what they want, and that is the rule of law. They're not necessarily saying, of course, all of them being democracies and the Quads being democracies, they talk about that element as well, but it's really the rite of passage, the ability for all countries to use that. And in that sense, there was also an excellent question. By the way, all the questions have been brilliant. There was an excellent question about India's naval power. And I think that is growing, not as to the extent that the Navy would want. India's Navy still has less than 20% of the defense budget. The Army still gets the bulk of it. And the reason for that is really precisely as the questioner asked, is to ensure that the rule of law and the sea lanes are open and free for everybody. So that's an important element. And if I might, the very last question I want to pick up there is the one on Africa. And I think it's a really excellent question because in my opinion, I think unfortunately, India, like the United States, has been playing catch up in Africa and following China. China has really been the lead in Africa more than any of the other rising powers. But there's one important area where I think the United States, India, and other countries can play a role, and that is to provide alternatives to the Belt Road Initiative. We can see that the Belt Road Initiative has created problems which are economic, apart from being political as well. If these countries are serious about engaging with Africa, they also need to be very, very serious about having an alternative to the Belt Road Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. And thank you for pulling in some of these very good questions from the Q&A box that I had wanted to get to. And I'm very glad that you addressed them because they're excellent. We have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to turn to you, Ambassador Singh, to see if I'll see how many we can get in. We have one about India's alliances and balancing its relations with other global powers. But the questioner wants to know, what soft power does India use to promote its influence globally?
So in terms of dimensions of soft power, I think, Indian music, there is the Indian films have had tremendous impact in different parts of the world. I remember when I served in Moscow, people would stop me in the street and start singing songs from Indian movies. I experienced the same in Africa, or when I was serving in the Middle East and West Asia. And aside from that, I think the very message of the autonomy of decision-making, the message of giving voice to the concerns of developing countries, which is very often ignored in terms of decisions that are taken in the leading powers, that have a big impact in enhancing India's soft power in the global context.
Can I add one more thing to that, actually? I think the ambassador summed it up really well. But there is also another soft power that India, I would categorize as soft power that India has, that even though India has never engaged in democracy promotion abroad, like the United States, right? That's never been a part of its foreign policy. The fact that India is a democracy is a huge source of its soft power. And I think that's underestimated in India a lot, because typically rising powers are seen as challengers. Right? When you have a rising power in the system, typically, historically, that's those kind of countries are seen as challengers. India has never been seen as a challenger, right? So you've had two rising powers this age, China and India, and India is seen as benign and China is not. And I would argue that much of that is due to the fact that India is democratic, which, going back to the first question that was asked about authoritarianism, what role that would, if there is rising authoritarianism in India, and depending on how things play out leading up to the next elections, what effect that has on India's reputation as a democracy, and then what reputation that would have on India as a rising power, I think is very much up for debate.
I think if I could just add on that, it's recognized that India is functioning as an elected democracy with regular elections. Of course, there are different assessments of the outcomes of those elections, But the regularly held elections, the Election Commission of India conducts the process very, very well. That's not challenged. And I think one element that is also important is the growing size of the Indian origin diaspora around the world. We have about 30 million people of Indian origin across the world. Their contributions in different societies are highly respected. You now see leaders across the world of Indian origin. The Prime Minister of Britain is a person of Indian origin. The Prime Minister of Ireland is a person of Indian origin. The Prime Minister of Portugal is a person of Indian origin. You have many leaders in the Caribbean. The Vice President of the United States is a person of Indian origin. Many CEOs in Silicon Valley are persons of Indian origin. And you have professors here who are in the United States, persons of Indian origin, very well established. So, so this growing presence of the Indian origin diaspora making important contributions in those societies is also an element.
That seems like a terrific place to end on Republic Day. Thank you. Thanks to the three of you for, I think, a really fantastic, eye-opening discussion. A lot of really tremendous points being made. I really appreciate your taking the time. India is definitely a space to watch, and we'll be doing, I hope, a lot more about India as well. With that, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you for the phenomenal answers, and have a wonderful day, everybody, or evening.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more insight and analysis on global issues, and to learn more about how you can join our community, visit us at network2020.org.